Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. This week I'm going to be talking to you about King Crimson in a couple different ways. King Crimson is a band that has been hugely influential to me over the course of my musical career listening. A progressive rock fan. I got into them in 1989 whenever Indiscipline came out and slowly got into their entire back catalog. And their catalog is very large and it's very confusing. If you want to talk about a band that's had more lineup changes per square inch of almost anybody, King Crimson's up there. So much so that the problem of their identity almost dissolves like bands like Yes, where you have to sort of keep this sort of sense of continuity from one lineup to the next. King Crimson would instead, have a lineup, and then that lineup was dissolved, and then they would reform with almost an entirely different mission statement, and then dissolve and reform. And this happened virtually every decade. So there's a version of King Crimson for the 60s, for the 70s, for the 80s, for the 90s, all the way through their career. But the reason I really want to talk about them right now is because I saw King Crimson on their tour very recently, their 2021 tour, Music is Our Friend. And I want to talk a little bit about that show and what the way the band is right now. And then kind of use that to talk a little bit about one of their past albums that maybe doesn't get as much attention as maybe it should. Now here's where I have to apologize a little bit, because you'll notice in this video I don't have any music clips in it. And this is a frustrating thing, which is one of the reasons why I've never covered King Crimson before, despite them being a huge influence on me. It's because King Crimson is a blocker. They will not let you put any music or any videos up of their music. And I respect that. It's the band's choice. I'm not trying to go against that. And rather than spend a bunch of time finding video clips and putting them in there just to find out I have to take them out, I'm just not going to bother. But I will, below, give you some clips in the description so you have an idea about what I'm talking about. The current lineup of King Crimson is a 7-member beast. Of course, still headed up by Robert Fripp. Robert Fripp, the guitar player, is the person who has been King Crimson since its inception. And the current version of King Crimson is a little bit different. You see, each version of King Crimson that's gone through history has kind of always generally stuck with the repertoire associated with that band. So in the 80s, they mainly played stuff from the 80s group. In the 90s, they mainly played stuff from the 90s group. And maybe some stuff from the 80s, because there was a lot of crossover in the personnel at that time. But the current version of King Crimson is a little bit more broad in its scope than past versions. This current version, which has been touring basically in this form for almost 10 years, has 3 drummers at the front of the stage and then 4 guys in the backstage, 7 members total. Drummers, Pat Mostellato, Jeremy Stacy, and Gavin Harrison. Gavin Harrison, of course, coming from Porcupine Tree fame, and a showstopper, a guy that really commands a lot of attention in the current live lineup. And then Robert Fripp, of course, Jacko Jaksic, who is now currently playing second guitar and singing for them, and has a very interesting backstory with him where he was playing with a lot of different bands and ended up actually playing with a version of the band that called the 21st Century Schizoid Band that really was focusing on the early work of King Crimson, which has worked extremely well for this particular lineup. Of course, Tony Levin on bass and stick and everything else that's low. And then Mel Collins on saxophone. I'm going to talk about him more in a second. So what's unique about this particular lineup is that they're not really playing the hits from any given lineup. Instead, because it's such a big group, they're really doing more of a retrospective look than any other version of the band has done. As a matter of fact, they're really focusing a lot on pre-1980s work. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Of course, the pre-1980s work was known quite a bit for having some personnel changes, guests coming in and out. And sometimes I think the studio versions of those early albums were very difficult to render in a live setting. With 7 guys on stage and people doubling instruments and a drummer, Jeremy Stacy, who's also doubling on keyboards and mellotron, you can cover a lot of bases. So not only are they doing a very good job of rendering different parts of King Crimson's catalog, but they're also expanding on those parts of the catalog to kind of fit the new membership of the group. For example, this particular lineup has focused a lot on Red, which is an interesting album to talk about in this regard, because if you're a fan of the early King Crimson, you probably love Red. And if you're a fan of the 80s King Crimson, like me, which is a lot different whenever Adrian Belew was their lead person, you probably still accept that Red is a pretty great album. So they focused on that album a lot. And with the 3 drummers across the front of the stage, in a way, it almost feels like they have to have 3 drummers to add up to the work that Bill Bruford did. There's a lot of interplay between those 3 guys. They'll play like One More Red Nightmare, which has a really distinctive percussion parts to it. And they trade off. A lot of these things, you see the drummers just having this conversation with each other and trying to make things happen in an improvised way, which is interesting because King Crimson, and although they have a very strong improvised component, they also don't cut corners. They have songs that are They're written out in a specific way. And if you've got a song that takes 10 minutes on the record, it's going to take 10 minutes plus a little bit whenever you see them live. So the set list for this last show really only held like 7 or 8 songs, even though it was a 2-hour concert, because they were playing songs to their full capacity. And also very interestingly with these later ones, the 2 or 3 songs that they play post-1980 are either instrumental tracks, or they did quite a bit of rewriting to kind of accommodate the fact that Adrian Belew's not in the band. Pre-1980, the singers for King Crimson always had this kind of a choir boy quality. You had Greg Lake and you had John Wetton. These two guys are kind of similar in voice to a degree. But Adrian Belew is a lot more distinctive player. And really a lot of what happened with the 80s group on happened because of what Adrian Belew was doing with them. His distinctive personality is impossible to tease out from the work that they were doing. So anytime they've done anything with that era of the band post-1980, they really have to do a little bit of rewriting to get around the lack of Adrian Belew's distinctive personality. Now, they certainly have the chops on stage to cover the parts, but Adrian Belew's idiosyncratic way of singing and doing lyrics, you can't have somebody else do it without just trying to copy what Adrian Belew did. And one of the really amazing ones they do is they do the song Indiscipline from the album Discipline. And rather than kind of Adrian Belew's spoken word thing that he does in that song, they've actually written out a kind of a jazzy melody to it that Jacko Jaksic and Tony Levin kind of have harmonized. So it's a totally different take. But doing that song allows them to open up and do a lot of other things instrumentally that they would not be able to do in the parts of the repertoire. So point being is that as a person who's in the 80s, a fan of the 80s iteration of King Crimson going forward, this is my introduction to the group, I of course miss Adrian Belew a lot. But there is an interesting dynamic in King Crimson that Adrian Belew represents that is still represented in the current lineup, which I think is really fascinating. And as a matter of fact, this is a thread that goes out throughout all of King Crimson's career. You always have Robert Fripp. Robert Fripp is extremely exact. He's extremely melodic with his soloing. He improvises, but generally speaking, he walks on stage having a really good idea about what it is he's going to do. If you watch King Crimson with Adrian Belew is totally improvising, flying by the seat of his pants. I think he very often is very surprised about what's coming out of his instrument as anybody else's. But that aspect of the chaos, the melodic solo chaos that was happening with King Crimson was still present pre-1980. It just took different forms. And that is represented, I think, in the current lineup by the presence of Mel Collins. Now, Mel Collins is playing saxophone, flute, variety of woodwind instruments on one part of the stage. And he provides this sense of controlled chaos that Adrian Belew would be doing. As a matter of fact, for some reason, Mel Collins was unable to perform with King Crimson. If you could just plop Adrian Belew in that corner just playing guitar, he would provide a lot of the same feel for what the current version of King Crimson is doing that Mel Collins does. And whenever they cover the 1980s material, 1980s and beyond, Mel Collins is covering a lot of the soloing that Adrian Belew did. So it's really interesting, and I really have come to appreciate the place that Mel Collins holds in the King Crimson history. Matter of fact, in a specific point in King Crimson's history, Mel Collins ended up being very responsible for King Crimson's continuing presence. Because you look at about 1970, 1971, and that era of King Crimson, this is the kind of the end of the first stage of the group. You talk about it, The Court of the Crimson King, that was released with, 1969 with Greg Lake and Ian McDonald, and that group kind of erupted onto the scene. But it just kept dissolving. After that point, they made a second album that was almost like a carbon copy of the first, In the Wake of Poseidon. It was a lot like it in The Court of the Crimson King. And then they had Lizard, which I thought was kind of for me personally, a very disjunct album. It's kind of one of my least favorite King Crimson albums. I know some people will fight me on that, but it's my feeling on it. And part of this is because there were so many people coming in and out of the group that nothing had a chance to really solidify. And so they'd be bringing guest artists in. Lizard quite famously has John Anderson coming in and singing lead. But by the time they get to end of Lizard, the band had completely dissolved. It was just Robert Fripp and Mel Collins. And Robert Fripp was very discouraged by this state. He'd been working for 3 years to kind of get something to happen. And people kept leaving the group. And partially, I think it's because Robert Fripp had this vision for what he wanted King Crimson to be, but he wasn't quite sure how to get there. So in 1970, the entire band had dissolved with the exception of himself and Mel Collins. And he was so discouraged by this, he told Mel Collins, look, if we're going to put a new band together, I want to have you head up the auditions because I just can't emotionally do it. He was kind of checking out at that point. So Mel Collins was kind of responsible for putting together the group that would end up making the album Islands. And Islands is a really underrated entry in King Crimson's catalog, and I'll admit that it is perhaps a little bit uneven. I think that you could argue that. But it's also very unique because it has the lineup of the band that doesn't exist anywhere else. This is sort of a touring lineup of the group that really had all the playing capacity and all the creativity of earlier versions of the group. But there's also a certain cohesiveness with that group that would kind of define what was happening in the mid-70s when the John Wetton group would come into play. Now, Islands was made up of course, Robert Fripp, and of course, Mel Collins. Mel Collins found the drummer Ian Wallace. And Ian Wallace, I think, is very, very, again, underrated in the big picture of things. A lot of what he does on Islands kind of predicts the kind of drumming that Bill Bruford would be doing very soon. He doesn't quite have the high concept, I think, but definitely the feel and the sound that he's using definitely predicts, I think, where Bill Bruford would fit into the group in just a couple of years. And then the very interesting entry in the whole thing was Boz Burrell. Boz Burrell ended up being tagged as the lead singer early on. And then they had another person who was going to play bass for a while. That person backed out. And so Boz Burrell was a guitar player, and Robert Fripp just kind of took it on himself to teach Boz Burrell the bass parts for the songs. It gave him like 2 weeks to do it, and he did it. And so despite not being a very studied bass player, really was able to hold down the kind of work that Greg Lake had been doing and Gordon Haskell had been doing up to that point, and sing. And by all accounts, even though there's not a whole lot of video footage of him singing with King Crimson during this time, Boz Burrell was a pretty charismatic frontman, a pretty great lead vocalist. And then really it's a shame that he didn't get a chance to expand his place in the band before Robert Fripp kind of called it quits. I think that there's some tensions going on with the album that are hard to discern. A big one is that another person who was involved with Islands was Peter Sinfield. And up to this point, Peter Sinfield had been a member of King Crimson as a lyricist and as a visualist for the band. He didn't really contribute musically besides just making lyrics that the band would sing. And by this point, I think that Robert Fripp was kind of tired of Peter Sinfield's, especially his lyrics. Some of his lyrics at this point, especially getting a little bit cringe. It sort of becomes part of what progressive rock sort of started to be known for as far as its negative connotations, kind of goofy lyrics. So you have to overlook that part of it. But the other thing that's interesting about it is that even though Robert Fripp is leading the band and he's a big presence on getting this whole thing together, his guitar playing is very sparse throughout the album. And of course, as a person that got into King Crimson in 1980, where it's all guitars, it's very odd to have 2 or 3 songs in and have just very, very sparse guitars from Robert Fripp. But I will say that gives the rest of the group quite a bit of space to spread out. You have a couple tracks on here, like the opening track, Formentera Lady, and a little bit later, the
Song of the Gulls.
These 2 songs are very kind of, I don't want to say orchestral, but definitely like chamber music in the way that they feel. Lots of oboe, lots of saxophones and flutes, that's from Mel Collins, and just a wider variety of instruments represented that aren't really in the group. Okay, this is one of the reasons why covering these songs with just a 4-piece, which is what King Crimson was at the time, is a little bit tricky. But when you look at the current lineup with all the free hands and all the open-ended musicianship going on, the songs render extremely well. But there are also definitely several standout tracks on the album. The Sailor's Tale is the second track, and it's an extended track, 12-minute track. And this one definitely has a lot more characteristics that you could point back to the earlier versions of King Crimson as to where they're getting their inspirations from. It definitely has a feel kind of in the Court of the Crimson King to a small extent, especially in its form. It has like this sort of loud, cacophonous middle section that careens out of control. Robert Fripp plays some very, very loud sheets of sound. Also some quieter sections. The opening part, just, as the Sailor's Tale, you hear this woman singing this kind of ghostly voice that sounds like, the siren song of a sailor. I think that's probably what that's supposed to represent. But a very characteristic King Crimson track, and actually very well sung by Boz Burrell. Finally, though, the last track is the one, the song Islands. This is the one I think that if you're going to get any track off this album, this is the one. And actually, I don't think that it's a super perfect track. I think there's some flaws to it. But this is the one that kind of predicts, I think, where the band is headed. It's got an excellent, excellent melody that's very spacious and gives a real sense of awe and openness. And then it has this sense of starting very, very small and growing and just building and building and building, almost like in a post-rock sense. And we see this later on in later iterations with King Crimson, especially the tune Starless at the end of Red, is one that breaks almost entirely down after an opening statement of a very clear and memorable melody, and just builds and builds and builds. But Islands, instead of becoming more and more cacophonous, just becomes more and more galactic, more and more cosmic in the way that it grows. And the cosmic overtones, of course, are brought on a little bit by the album cover as well, so that it has that sense of, spaciousness that visual provides. Most memorably at the end, there's this cornet, this trumpet solo. And it's funny because really the vocabulary that trumpet player is doing is clearly an improvised solo, but his vocabulary feels very kind of limited. It doesn't sound like the best trumpet solo ever. It's not super ingenious. But man, it's really moving. It's got this, it's very heartfelt, I think, and it adds a lot to the track. So Islands is a track that I think is very beautiful in its original version, but one that the current version of King Crimson that's now touring is playing a lot. It's pretty regular. And what's really interesting about this version of it is not only is it, does it capture the feeling of the early King Crimson, but towards the end when it becomes more of a piano, a little more traditional idea of a progressive rock tune, Tony Levin and his bass playing on that almost makes it start to feel like a Peter Gabriel song. It starts to have this nice kind of open-ended, positive bounce to it that you don't get in the lower parts of King Crimson's catalog. And so I really appreciate this version of King Crimson, the current touring version of this King Crimson, pulling the song out of the mothballs and reinventing it in a way that makes sense for the players that are on the stage. And it's beautiful. And as I was listening to this song at the concert last week, it really struck me about how big a part King Crimson has played in my musical growth over the years, ever since high school up till even now. And so this concert, I really had the good fortune to go with some really good friends. And these guys were all folks that came from different aspects of my background. I have some friends from high school that went. I had some friends from college that went. I have some more recent friends that went. And all these guys got together and we kind of went as a large group. And it was really cool to see all these people visit with each other. This concert gave me a really interesting and bittersweet sense of closure and finality, especially like its more apocalyptic senses. King Crimson has this very apocalyptic sense, especially in those earlier albums. And it gave me the sense that I was really saying goodbye to a big chunk of my life whenever we went to see the concert. So it's a concert that I'm going to very, very long remember, and definitely one that made a huge impression on me, as the couple times I've seen King Crimson before. But this one was really special, not only because of the way King Crimson played and the way that they had this huge retrospective of their catalog, and it was reinvented in a way that was not just covering the tunes, but making it feel like those tunes belonged to the people on stage. But also because I got to go with really good friends that all meant a lot to me, and they all meant a lot to me more so because they came out and we all got a chance to get together before I make the big move. So I want to thank those guys for going if you're watching. It was really super meaningful to me, and I had a really great time in the concert. And I want to thank the members of King Crimson for coming out and during this really trying time, trying to tour, making every effort. It's not easy to be a band from England, to get all the visas to come to the US and tour now, especially things are kind of taking a weird turn. It was very special and very meaningful, and I will long remember it. But that's all I have to say about King Crimson and about Islands for this week. So if you like this video, please like it, subscribe to it, share out to your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I'll be putting a King Crimson track up over on my Spotify list for 2021. And I'll hopefully catch you guys next week. Till then, I'll see you on the flip side.